Here's a question for you. If I put two bottles of oil side by side on a supermarket shelf, one of them, extra virgin olive oil, mechanically extracted from fresh olives, it's rich in natural polyphenols, and with one of the most impressive research records of any food on the planet. And the other one is a highly refined cooking oil. Which one do you think should get the higher health star rating? If you said the extra virgin olive oil, you'd be using common sense. And under the current system, you'd be wrong. Canola oil can score up to 4.5 stars. Sunflower oil can score up to 4. Extra virgin olive oil, 3 to 3.5. Today, we need to talk about the Health Star rating, what it gets right, what it gets wrong, and why it matters, because Australia is now considering making it mandatory. Because a food label that is meant to help us to make healthier choices should not steer us away from one of the healthiest fats in the human diet. Welcome back to Delicious Science. I'm Dr. Joanna McMillan. I'm a nutrition scientist, dietitian, and today I'm a slightly frustrated policy nerd. You've all seen the Health Star rating. It's the little front of pack symbol on packaged foods, giving a product anywhere from 0.5 to 5 stars. And more stars are meant to indicate the healthier choice. Now, in principle, I support that. I support clear front of label packaging, and I support tools that help us all to navigate the supermarket. Because food labels are confusing, supermarkets are noisy, and if you're standing in the breakfast cereal aisle trying to choose between two products, especially if you've got someone small, asking for the one with cartoon animals on it, a simple visual cue can be genuinely useful. The Health Star rating can work well when it's used as it was intended to be used, and that is to compare similar packaged foods. And for a lot of such foods, it actually works reasonably well compared to breakfast cereals, to muesli bars, to flavoured milks. And the Health Star rating can do a decent job of steering you towards the better option. But the system is now being reviewed with a view to making it mandatory. Now, I understand why, because less than 40% of products are currently carrying the HSR. But before we do that, before we require this label across all intended packaged foods, we need to have an honest conversation about where the algorithm fails. Because in some categories, it doesn't just fail quietly, it risks misleading consumers. And the clearest example is cooking oils. Let's start with how the Health Star rating works. The algorithm scores foods based on a set of nutrients. So energy, saturated fat, total sugars, and sodium, that's salt, count against a product, while protein, fibre, fruit, vegetable, nut, and legume content can count in its favour. Great so far. But that's not all there is to food. But for many multi-ingredient packaged foods, that gives the algorithm something useful to work with. So a breakfast cereal or a granola might vary in sugar, fibre and sodium, or get some positive points for the presence of nuts or seeds. A pasta sauce might vary in energy, sodium, added sugar, saturated fat and vegetable content. You get the idea. So far, so reasonable. Now apply that same logic to cooking oils. All oils are energy dense. That's not a flaw, that's just the nature of fat. Most oils contain negligible sugar and sodium. They don't contain fibre or protein. Nothing is added. So when the algorithm assesses oils, there's only one variable left to move that score. So the main differentiating factor becomes saturated fat. One number in the algorithm doing all of the work. And that means that biologically meaningless small changes of only a few grams in saturated fat can mean the difference of a half or even a full star on the end packet. Now, this is why extra virgin olive oil, an oil primarily made up of monounsaturated fat, but contains a slightly, not dramatically, higher proportion of saturated fat than some other oils like canola or sunflower, so it ends up with fewer stars. And while some are saying, oh, come on, that doesn't really matter, all of these oils are scoring highly, I disagree. The system is telling us that more stars equals healthier. And in this example, that's simply not true. Now, I want to be very clear about something here because this matters. This is not a seed oils are toxic argument. That is not what I'm saying. And it's not where the science sits. I did a whole episode on this topic, so you can go and have a listen to that if you're interested in hearing more. So I am not saying that canola oil is poisonous. I'm not saying sunflower oil is dangerous, and I'm not joining that online chorus claiming that all seed oils are inflammatory or toxic. The human evidence does not support that kind of sweeping claim. Replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fats, including polyunsaturated fats, has been a part of cardiovascular nutrition guidance for decades. On that narrow question, replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat, many seed and vegetable oils do have evidence behind them. But it's not the whole story. The issue is not that seed oils are toxic. The issue is that not all unsaturated oils are the same food. There's a huge difference between a highly refined cooking oil and extra virgin olive oil. Many common vegetable and seed oils are extracted and then refined using high heat, high pressure, and/or chemicals. They're bleached and deodorized to create a neutral, stable, inexpensive, high-volume oil. Now, that doesn't make them poisonous, but it does make them very different from extra virgin olive oil, which is mechanically extracted from the olive, and it retains a complex mix of naturally occurring compounds. Extra virgin olive oil is not just a source of fat. It contains biophenols and other bioactive compounds, including oleocanthal, hydroxytyrosol, tyrosol, tocopherols, and a range of other compounds that contribute to antioxidant effects, anti-inflammatory effects, and cardiometabolic effects. They're not decorative extras. They're part of what makes extra virgin olive oil biologically interesting, and through a culinary lens, makes them delicious as part of their flavor profile. And while seeds and other plants used to make the common cooking oils also contain interesting phytonutrients in their whole form, these are almost entirely lost during that industrial refining process. That's also true, by the way, for refined olive oil. It's often labeled as pure or light olive oil, which is very confusing, but essentially you're losing almost all of those phytonutrients that are present in the extra virgin olive oil. So when we compare extra virgin olive oil with any refined oil, the most meaningful distinction is not simply a few grams of saturated fat per 100 grams of the oil. It's processing, its bioactive compounds, its oxidative stability, including when you're cooking, its culinary use, it's the evidence from long-term dietary patterns, and, in the case of extra virgin olive oil, Mediterranean dietary patterns in particular. But the Health Star rating algorithm doesn't see these things. All it sees is saturated fat. It does not see the bitterness and pepperiness of a good extra virgin olive oil, the very sensory cues that tell us that those phenolic compounds are present. It doesn't see the difference between an oil mechanically extracted from fresh olives and an oil that's been refined to remove colour, odour, and flavour. It doesn't see the Mediterranean diet evidence, and it certainly doesn't see how that oil is used in real life, drizzled over vegetables, cooked with legumes, used in salads, eaten with fish, with herbs, with whole grains, and all the other foods that make up one of the most researched dietary patterns in the world. Now, that's not a failure of the oil, it's a design limitation of the algorithm. Now, there's a broader issue here that goes well beyond oils. The Health Star rating was partly designed to encourage food manufacturers to reformulate packaged foods, to reduce sodium, to reduce added sugar, to replace saturated fat, increase fibre, improve the product, and the stars go up. Now, in some categories, that can be a good thing. If a manufacturer lowers the salt in a soup, if it reduces added sugar in breakfast cereal, or it increases fibre in bread, that can support better public health outcomes. But, and it's a big but, reformulation can also become a game. A manufacturer can engineer a product to perform better under the algorithm without necessarily making it meaningfully more nourishing. Add isolated fiber, add protein, replace sugar with sweeteners, swap ingredients, manipulate the nutrient profile just enough to climb half a star. There is a no added sugar granola on the market currently. All they did was remove the sugar to make that claim, but what did they replace it with? Maltodextrin. Technically, that doesn't get counted as sugar on the nutrition information panel, but guess what? It's just short chains of glucose molecules that are very quickly broken down into glucose and absorbed rapidly. It's got a high GI. It's basically sugar, and it should be labelled as such, but that's just a technicality. And that's just one example of many I could give you of where a food manufacturer can game the system. That's why you'll often see products that hit the media with how on earth has this got a health star rating of 4 or 5, when common sense you can look at the product and know this might not be the best. The stars go up, but the overall food quality may not. We see this kind of thing all the time in nutrition. A product can look better on paper while remaining highly processed. It can technically tick the boxes while still being a long way from what most of us would call a genuinely nourishing food. Now, I do get that no front-of-pack system is perfect because food is complex. It can't measure everything. But we do have to pay attention to and do something about the big anomalies. Contrast those multi-ingredient packaged foods with extra virgin olive oil. It's a single-ingredient culinary food. There is nothing to reformulate. You can't add fiber to extra virgin olive oil. You can't reduce its kilojoules and have it remain an oil. You can't lower its saturated fat without fundamentally changing what it is. So a minimally processed traditional food is judged by a very narrow nutrient calculation, while more highly processed foods can be engineered to suit the calculation. That's a very strange incentive for a public health system. And it gets to the heart of the problem. A nutrient algorithm can reward formulation engineering over genuine food quality. Now, this is not just about oils. Cooking oils are the clearest example, but they're not the only category where the health star rating can struggle. The deeper issue is that food is more than just a few nutrients. Food has structure. It has a matrix, what we call the food matrix. It's got a processing history. It has bioactive compounds present. It's got culinary use. Food has context within a dietary pattern. We have spent decades in nutrition science moving beyond overly reductionist thinking. It's what's caused many of the problems in the past. Yes, nutrients matter. Saturated fat does matter. Sodium matters, fiber matters, protein matters. But food is not just a spreadsheet. A piece of cheese is not simply saturated fat plus sodium plus protein. A handful of almonds is not simply fat plus kilojoules. A lean piece of beef is not simply protein with some saturated fat. And extra virgin olive oil is not simply unsaturated fat with a little bit of saturated fat. And this is where the health star rating can become too blunt. It measures what is easy to measure. It doesn't necessarily measure what matters most. So let's take a look at a few other categories. Dairy foods. Dairy gives us an important precedent. When the health star rating was first applied to dairy foods, problems emerged because foods like cheese, milk and yogurt could be penalised heavily for their saturated fat content. But dairy is not just saturated fat. Milk, yogurt and cheese provide high-quality protein, calcium, iodine, riboflavin, vitamin B12 and a whole bunch of other nutrients. Fermented dairy foods may have probiotics present and organic compounds produced during that fermentation process that may also be beneficial. All these dairy foods have a food matrix. We call that now the dairy matrix, and it appears to influence how they behave in the body. Cheese is a perfect example. If you only look at saturated fat and sodium, cheese can look like a food to avoid. But that's not what the scientific evidence shows. And by the way, it's a fermented food. The evidence around cheese and cardiometabolic health is far more complex. The matrix matters, calcium matters, fermentation matters. So the food behaves differently from an equivalent amount of saturated fat either eaten in isolation or from some other foods. So importantly, the Health Star rating system has already made category-specific adjustments for dairy. It has separate dairy categories. It has different scoring pathways for cheese. Calcium can be taken into account. So in other words, the system has already acknowledged that a narrow, saturated fat lens can produce misleading outcomes. Now that matters because it shows that category-specific correction is possible. The system can be changed when the algorithm does not align well with nutrition science or with dietary guidance. So the question is obvious. If we could recognize the complexity of dairy, why can't we recognize the complexity of extra virgin olive oil? If saturated fat alone was too blunt a measure for cheese, why are we allowing it to dominate the assessment of oils? So let's talk about a category where it does a little bit better. Nuts and seeds. They're useful to talk about because in many cases the Health Star rating does get them right. Plain, unsalted nuts generally rate well, and they should. Nuts are energy dense, they contain fat, and like extra virgin olive oil, they do contain small amounts of saturated fat. That does vary by nut type. But they're also rich in unsaturated fats, in protein, fiber, minerals, phytosterols, and a whole range of phytonutrients. They are linked with better cardiovascular health, improved satiety, and healthier dietary patterns. The algorithm gives positive points for fruit, vegetable, nut, and legume content. It's called the FVNL component, fruit, vegetable, nut, legume. That helps prevent nuts from being punished simply for being energy dense. Tahini, made from ground sesame seeds, and if it's a good tahini, that's all that's in there, can score 5 stars, quite rightly. But once you extract the oil from a seed or a fruit and lose that food matrix, the algorithm has far fewer variables to work with, and saturated fat starts doing far too much of the judging. Flavored nuts, salted nuts, coated nuts, and highly processed nut products containing nuts can all land quite differently. And that's fair enough. A raw almond is not the same as a honey-roasted salted nut mix, and neither is the same as a chocolate-coated almond. Nuts remind us that whole foods can be high in fat and still be healthy. Indeed, far healthier than low-energy, low-fat, highly processed snack foods. This is why the Health Star rating must be used within category. So comparing those nuts, or a nut product, a reformulated low-sugar gummy lolly can get 5 stars because it's low in sugar and it's high in added fiber. But which do you think is healthier? Extra virgin olive oil is getting that 3 to 3.5 stars. Those stars are not telling you that a fiber-sweetened gummy is nutritionally equivalent to tahini or superior to extra virgin olive oil. They're only meaningful when comparing similar foods. But consumers don't get that, and they don't always use them that way. And apart from that, the categories can be quite complicated. What is in the same category, and how can you make sure that you're comparing like with like? Now let me bring in another whole food category because the meat situation is illuminating, and it has a new wrinkle under the proposed mandatory system. Currently, plain cuts of fresh meat are exempt from displaying the Health Star rating, and that exemption is sensible. Fresh meat is a single ingredient whole food, and the algorithm was never designed for it. The moment you add a marinade or any additional ingredient, however, the HSR becomes required. Now, I think that's a reasonable line. But here's where it gets more complicated. Under the proposed mandatory system, if a fresh protein, whether it's red meat, chicken or seafood, makes a nutrient claim on pack, so that might be something like a source of protein, which they absolutely should be able to do, of course. These are the whole food protein sources. The HSR is now triggered. Now, what's the problem there? That means producers making a perfectly legitimate and accurate nutritional statement about their product are suddenly required to display a star rating on food the system was never built to assess. Think about what that incentivizes. Producers who choose simply not to make nutritional claims, not because those claims are wrong, but because making them pulls them into an HSR framework that doesn't serve the product well. That's a strange outcome for a system meant to support consumer understanding. When fresh meat is rated, and lean beef and lamb do score 4.5 stars under the current algorithm, the outcome's actually directionally defensible. Lean cuts score higher, untrimmed cuts score between 3.5 and 4, with the score tracking saturated fat content. For this category, that broadly aligns with dietary guidance, so the algorithm isn't wrong here. It's just being applied to a food it wasn't designed for. The problem is consistency, because the star rating on a fresh meat product is calculated from the nutritional panel data that each producer inputs themselves, and that data is highly variable. You can end up with the same cut of meat carrying a different star rating from one producer to the next. Same food, different stars on the same supermarket shelf. For a consumer, trying to use those stars to guide their choices, that's not helpful. It's confusing. And I think this points to a broader design tension. The HSR was built for packaged, multi-ingredient processed foods, where the algorithm has multiple variables to work with. The more you push it into single-ingredient whole foods, oils, meat, fish, the more it starts to buckle because the algorithm simply doesn't have enough to go on. It wasn't designed for this territory, which raises a genuine question about whether mandating it across all categories without category-specific reviews is actually going to serve consumers the way it's intended to. Now, Australia isn't alone in grappling with this. Europe has its own front-of-pack system called Nutri-Score. This is a letter-grade system running from dark green A at the top down through B, C, D to a red E. Now, when Nutri-Score was first applied to oils, it had exactly the same problem. Extra virgin olive oil received a D, an orange label, nearly at the bottom. Now, Italy in particular pushed back hard. Olive oil is central to Italian food culture, identity, and economy, and having a government nutrition label put it near the bottom of the scale? Well, to put that diplomatically, it was not well received. The same was true, of course, across the Mediterranean region, including Spain and Greece and the like. So the algorithm was revised in 2023. Olive oil improved. It now sits at B, a light green. But here's what the revision still hasn't fixed. Nutri-Score can't differentiate between extra virgin olive oil and cheaper refined olive oil. Both get a B. A shopper choosing on labels alone might reach for the cheaper bottle, thinking that they're making an equivalent nutritional choice. They're not. Remember what I said earlier about what happens when you refine extra virgin olive oil? You're losing almost all of those beautiful phytochemicals. And there's a telling quote from the founder of Nutri-Score himself, who said publicly that olive oil will never reach the top green A rating because the system was designed for packaged foods and a pure oil, however healthy, will always be penalised under a fat-focused algorithm. What that tells me is that these front-of-pack systems weren't built with traditional whole foods in mind. When you apply them inside that domain, the algorithm starts to work against the very evidence it's supposed to reflect. Europe has at least partially acknowledged the problem. Australia now has the opportunity to learn from that and do it properly from the start. So what should happen? What am I calling for? Let me be very direct. I support front-of-pack nutrition labelling. I support it being mandatory because we need to see it across more of the products for which it was designed and intended for. I think it works fairly well in those categories. But cooking oils and edible fats should be exempt from mandatory HSR requirements until a proper independent review of the algorithm has been done specifically for that category. The current algorithm cannot assess oils fairly. Not because seed oils are dangerous, but because it has no way of recognizing the full picture of what makes one oil more beneficial than another. Any review should consider the degree of processing, the retention of naturally occurring bioactive compounds, the evidence from whole dietary patterns, particularly Mediterranean diet research, and the distinction between minimally processed and industrially refined products. And at the absolute minimum, we cannot have a system where a refined oil scores 4.5 stars, while the most thoroughly researched plant oil and nutrition science scores 3 to 3.5. Whatever your view on individual oils, that outcome is just not scientifically defensible. The broader principle is this: a public health label should not reduce food to only the nutrients that are easiest to count. Although I do get this as part of it. Simply count the nutrients that are listed on the nutrition information panel. But when the world has highly sophisticated systems for measuring all sorts of things, surely we can come up with a better way to evaluate food. We are now in an era of nutrition science where we understand much more about food complexity. We understand much more about the gut microbiome. We understand food matrices matter and why ultra-processing matters. We understand fermentation makes a difference. We understand phytonutrients in plant foods and zoonutrients in animal foods. We understand that dietary patterns matter much more than isolated nutrients, like saturated fat. And yet, front-of-pack labelling systems like the HSR are still built on a fairly old nutrient profiling model. Energy, sugar, salt, saturated fat, protein, fibre, and a few ingredient-based credits. That model can be still useful, but it's not enough for every food. So, what does all this mean when you're standing in the supermarket? Use the Health Star rating where it makes sense. If you're choosing between 2 breakfast cereals, look at the stars, but also check the nutrition information panel or the ingredients if you've got time. If you're choosing between 2 yogurts, the HSR may help, but still look at added sweeteners, protein levels, and any other additives. In other words, read the ingredients list, and that's a good tip for considering any food product. And if you're choosing between packaged snacks, the HSR can certainly be a useful nudge in the right direction. If you're comparing similar processed meat products, it may help you to choose one lower in sodium or saturated fat. But when you are choosing extra virgin olive oil, don't let 3 or 3.5 stars tell you it's somehow inferior to a highly refined oil with more stars. The algorithm simply cannot assess that category properly. For oils, look beyond the stars. Choose extra virgin olive oil as your primary culinary oil. Use it for cooking, dressings, roasting, sauteing, drizzling over vegetables, stirring through legumes. Quite simply, making simple food taste wonderful. It's not about fear, and it's not about demonizing seed oils. If you want to eat out and use some products, trust me, you're going to be getting them into your diet. But at home, why not use the best that there is, with very known and well-studied research outcomes? So this is about recognizing that extra virgin olive oil stands apart. I don't even put it in the same food category, and that the current Health Star rating simply does not reflect this. So here's my bottom line. The Health Star rating is a useful tool when it's used for the right job. But when we apply it to foods, it was quite simply not designed to assess properly, especially single-ingredient culinary foods like oils. We risk turning a public health tool into a source of confusion. I support front-of-pack labelling. I support helping Australians make healthier choices. But I do not support mandating a flawed algorithm in categories where we already know it can mislead. Fix the anomalies. Review the oils category. Respect the complexity of foods like dairy, nuts, seeds, meat, and extra virgin olive oil. And make sure that our nutrition policies reflect the science of food, not just the arithmetic of nutrients. Because more stars should mean more confidence. And right now for cooking oils, they don't. Now, I do want to make a disclosure. One thing I always want to be transparent about is that I am a non-executive director of Cobram Estate Olives, an Australian extra virgin olive oil company many of you will be familiar with. But I've also been involved in research and advocacy in this space, in the oil space, for almost 2 decades, precisely because it's such a fascinating and fabulous area of nutrition research. My views on the science are grounded in the published evidence and in my broader work as a nutrition scientist and dietitian. But you deserve to know that context, and I will always tell you when it's relevant, and this is one of those times. That's it for Delicious Science for today. If you found this useful, please share it, and I'd love you to follow and to leave a review, as it all helps me to build the podcast. Until next time, eat well, cook, drizzle and dress with the best quality extra virgin olive oil that you can. And remember that food is more than the nutrients it contains. It should be a joyful part of your day, not another stress.